All right, hello everyone, and welcome. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to H.C. Wainwright's fourth annual Kidney Conference. My name is Matthew Caulfield. I'm a senior biotech analyst here at H.C. Wainwright. We next welcome Akebia Therapeutics, and we're glad to welcome Nik Grund, Chief Commercial Officer at Akebia. So welcome, Nick. Great to see
Thanks,
you this
Matthew.
morning.
Thanks for having me.
Um, yeah, of course. Maybe to start off, could you provide a brief overview of Akebia and its commercial products for CKD patients that are on dialysis?
Yeah, absolutely. Akebia is a fully integrated biotech company. We got founded in 2007. We've got two commercial products. Importantly, we've got a sales team that has deep renal experience. We've got an R&D team that's demonstrated the ability to develop compounds and bring them through to clinical studies and eventually approval. And we've got a pipeline of early stage assets. Importantly, we're focused on really bettering the lives of people with kidney disease.
Mm-hmm.
As
Very helpful.
our
Yeah.
two assets is our Auryxia. First off, it's about 10-year-old phosphate binder.
Mm-hmm.
Its first indication is for the control of serum phosphorus in those patients that are on dialysis. Its
Mm-hmm.
second indication is for iron deficiency anemia in adult patients in non-dialysis. So not our first roadshow with anemia. There's about a 90% overlap between Auryxia physicians and Vafseo physicians, target physicians.
Mm-hmm.
And that brings us to Vafseo. We launched Vafseo back in January. It's indicated for the treatment of anemia due to chronic kidney disease in adult patients receiving dialysis.
Mm-hmm.
It's an oral HIF-PHI, a new mechanism of action. It stands for epoxy-inducible factor prolyl hydroxylase inhibitor, so a mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Really quickly, that mouthful really means that it stimulates the body's natural response to hypoxia, which enhances the body's natural production of erythropoietin to control anemia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's great. So considering that kidney patients can otherwise rely on erythropoiesis stimulating agents or ESAs and iron supplementation therapy, for example, what do you think are the greatest unmet needs facing CKD patients, based on standard of care that they've been accustomed to?
Yeah, Matt, you'd be surprised. ESA agents have been on the market 30 years. And
Sure.
despite this, nearly 25% of patients are struggling to hit their hemoglobin targets and falling in and out of the
Mm.
range. And despite this large percentage of patients not quite getting to goal, there's been very little innovation in this area until Vafseo. Nearly 30% of those patients who are on ESAs are on high doses of ESAs. With those higher doses of ESAs come increased risks of major cardiovascular events.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, as an oral therapy, patients can conveniently take Vafseo at home, which is ideal, particularly for those patients who are getting their dialysis at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, though broadly indicated, those two populations, which physicians think of first, represent about 40% of the dialysis patients.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very helpful. I mean, to kind of drill in a little bit more to what you described. So Vafseo is unique as an oral tablet. You mentioned it's the HIF-PH inhibitor as sort of a novel mechanism of action, treating anemia, CKD, dialysis patients. Are there any other main points, or can you discuss a little further the relevance of this differentiation within the CKD market?
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting. When you give an ESA, you see
Yeah.
these large spikes in hemoglobin with a reduction, and then they give the next dose, it's another large spike in hemoglobin and a reduction. With Vafseo, given its unique mechanism of action, you really see really small changes in EPO over time. And
Hmm.
that lower level of EPO changes results in a gentle rise in hemoglobin for those anemia patients. Secondly, since it's working upstream from where ESAs work, we also note that we're seeing iron mobilization, which may be linked to more efficient use of iron, which is important
Mm.
for creating red blood cells.
Hmm.
And in the pivotal Innovate study that led to our approval, it demonstrated also lower dose titrations for the product. So you're not having to titrate patients as often, which is a benefit to the clinic staff.
Absolutely. And being oral. I mean, I think that's a very helpful
Absolutely.
therapy as well. So you mentioned Vafseo launched commercially very recently back in January of this year. Maybe you could tell us a little bit of how the launch has progressed, any early trends you're observing among uptake,
Mhm.
enthusiasm, kind of where things stand for the initial launch stages.
Yeah, so we're still working to close out Q2. So really, when we look
Hmm.
at the first quarter of launch, we launched back in January. Overall, super pleased with how the initial launch of
Okay.
Vafseo went. When I think about a launch, I think about kind of breadth and depth of physicians writing. Breadth is how many are writing, and over 640 had written Vafseo in the first quarter of launch,
Hmm.
which is super good. Most of those physicians are within U.S. Renal Care. They were the fastest to move. We have great advocacy at U.S. Renal Care, but certainly expanding beyond U.S. Renal Care is important. The second I think about is depth of prescribing. That's the
Hmm.
number of prescriptions a physician writes. And on average in Q1, we saw about 12 prescriptions per physician. That range was super broad. We have still folks in the, we'll call it trial phase, 1 to 5 prescriptions. But on the other side of that spectrum, we have physicians that are over 100 prescriptions, which is really tending towards full adoption. And
Wow.
so,
Okay.
obviously, full adoption is where we want to get to. But that 12 would demonstrate there still, most folks are still in what I'll call the trial and early adoption phase as opposed to
Hmm.
complete adoption.
Understood. So that kind of parlays into the next question. We know uptake in the kidney space has some nuances. Can you talk a little bit about the path from initial small and mid-sized dialysis organizations? I know you mentioned US Renal Care and how that can progress ultimately into the large dialysis organizations or the LDOs. That's kind of a unique component to the kidney space.
Yeah, you used kind of two words that are often put with dialysis, nuanced and unique, right? And so when we think about the dialysis space, though it is unique, it's actually unfolding really closely to how we thought about it. As we
Okay.
thought about the launch, we always anticipated that the small to mid-sized dialysis organizations would go first. They would be faster through the
Hmm.
launch process. That segment is about 150,000 dialysis patients, so a large segment. But they
Hmm.
were going to move faster. And we saw that US Renal Care being the most, they're the third largest dialysis organization with about 36,000 patients. So
Hmm.
not small by any means, but certainly not the size of an LDO. An
Hmm.
LDO or a large dialysis organization, roughly 200,000 or above, that's Fresenius and DaVita, they go a little bit slower. They've got
Hmm.
more systems to integrate. They've got more decision-making layers between top to bottom. And certainly, while we expected in Q1 to be small to mid-size, that to fuel our growth into Q2, we anticipate in the second half of the year, LDOs will start to become a major player in that second half growth.
Hmm. That's great. Another important component to therapy adoption and access in the kidney space is the TDAPA component. Can you explain how that factor plays into the launch, patient access, and the timeframes related to that, and how that's impacted initial launch?
Yeah, TDAPA, another unusual nuance of dialysis. So it stands for Transitional Drug Add-on Payment Adjustment. And really what
Hmm.
it is first, a drug has to qualify for TDAPA, of which Vafseo has done. And it is under the prospective payment system, which applies to all ESRD products. And why they developed TDAPA CMS was they were worried that having one flat bundled rate per session would disincentivize dialysis organizations for giving innovation a try.
Hmm.
And so what they did is they set up this reimbursement mechanism known as TDAPA that really calls for a payment in addition to their bundled rate. So it's a payment they receive for qualifying drugs in addition to that bundled rate, and it really is there to incentivize folks to figure out how to operationalize innovation into normal treatment. It lasts about 2 years. After that, there's a whole convoluted mechanism of what happens for the next three, et cetera, et cetera. But the long and short of it is to be successful, not only do you have to have good economics during TDAPA, you have to provide dialysis organizations with certainty post TDAPA around pricing. And we've done that. We've contracted and worked with dialysis organizations to have their price post TDAPA be at approximately the standard ESA price at about $2,500 a year.
Hmm.
Importantly, while that is a price reduction from our initial starting dose price of about 15,500 per year, this is a billion-dollar market at $2,500 per year.
Sure.
And so, obviously, to be successful, we need to do that to provide that predictability.
Hmm. Understood. Could you tell us a little bit more about the upcoming pilot program for Vafseo with the large dialysis organizations? What expectations could look like for that development? I know you just mentioned the second half 25,
Yeah.
kind of overall for the LDOs. Can you tell us a little bit more about sort of that evolution there?
Yep, that's kind of we've talked about. We've had one of the LDOs is going to be doing a pilot program. One of the
Hmm.
reasons that LDOs take a little bit longer is sometimes they want to test the myriad of systems that they have in order to operationalize a new product. And so one of the large LDOs is going to initiate a pilot in Q3. It's a
Okay.
substantial size pilot between 75 and 200 clinics. If you think about 200 clinics, the third largest dialysis provider has about 700 clinics in total. So 200 is pretty sizable. It's what they call an operational pilot. They're not there to prove safety or efficacy. They're really there to test the system. Can a doctor
Mhm.
prescribe it? Does the patient get that prescription delivered to their home? Does the system indicate there's a refill? Does it help them control formulary of which patients have reimbursement for the product? So pretty much nuts and bolts of kind of how you get a new product prescribed to a patient. Since it
Mhm.
is an operational pilot, we're thinking 2 to 3 months long, for
Mhm.
which they'll open up Vastio use more broadly. And so certainly, moving from 75 to 200 clinics to over 200,000 patients is a massive opportunity for us, and we're likely to see that opening up in Q4 of this year.
Mhm. Excellent. Maybe if we could just change gears briefly to the other approved product, Auryxia or ferric citrate. So that's used for hyperphosphatemia, as you mentioned, that's kind of the primary indication. With that product losing exclusivity in March, what's the best way to think about sales in the near term and then kind of transitioning to focusing on Vafseo moving forward?
Yeah, when we think about Auryxia, frankly, we're really pleased with how Auryxia has done. It lost
Hmm.
exclusivity back in March, and at that time, the authorized generic launched. And so there's one generic, the authorized generic, on the marketplace today. But what we've seen from from Auryxia, is really strong clinical demand for the branded product. That's one in due to its strong clinical profile. Physicians are well aware around what Auryxia can do for their patients, but it's also the economic value proposition that we had in our contracting broadly with DOs. When we think about Auryxia, while we're really pleased with having that revenue, it could change at any moment. A second generic can enter that marketplace, which would have that market change really quickly. And so
Yeah.
internally here, we're really conservative for how we think about it. And so, every day that goes by is a day that we view as upside for the product historically. And so, as we look to the future, we're not hedging Auryxia revenue. We're not keeping Auryxia revenue front of mind, if you will, in terms of
Hmm.
what we do be successful as a company. The only other
Right.
thing I'll
Yeah.
say, Matt, is Auryxia, with over 10 years of experience, allowed us a foray into Vafseo. We no longer
Mhm.
promote Auryxia, despite its strong sales in Q1.
Mhm.
And so we are 100% focused on Vafseo.
Mhm. Excellent. So with Vafseo, offsetting generic impact on Auryxia ultimately as we move forward, can you further discuss the market opportunity for Vafseo in dialysis? You've kind of covered that, but also thinking about non-dialysis patients and how that could be sort of a commercial evolution for the product.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our intention with Vafseo is to have Vafseo become the standard of care. In
Yeah.
order to become the standard of care, you need things like clinical differentiation, which we already talked about with the MOA. You need
Hmm.
increasing real world physician experience. Physicians have to be using the product because as any new product launches in this space, it takes a little bit of time for physicians and staff to figure out how to use it.
Hmm.
You need this kind of post TDAPA transparency and contracting piece of it. But the last piece you need in dialysis is continued data generation, right? So how do you build the profile of a product over time? An example of that would be the voice trial that USRC is doing, and Dr. Block. That program and that study is designed to show a 10% decrease in hospitalization and mortality. Now,
Hmm.
it's pretty obvious hospitalization and mortality are benefits to patients, but they're also benefits to dialysis organizations. If you look at a 10% reduction in hospitalization, on average, a dialysis patient's hospitalized about 2 times a year, costs on average about 60,000 times each. It's $60,000 each time they're hospitalized. And the dialysis organizations are on the hook for a large part of that. And so saving 10% of that is a meaningful number per patient. Additionally, the patient, instead of being in the hospital, is in the chair receiving their dialysis, which they're earning revenue on. So
Hmm.
continuing to increase data and the value proposition around Vafseo is going to be important in dialysis.
No, I
The
think that makes
best,
complete, yeah, that makes
yeah,
sense.
the best way to create a standard of care in dialysis is to actually have patients start dialysis on Vafseo. And
Mm,
so that's where NDD starts to be so important. When you look at a patient who starts dialysis with their anemia well managed, their
hmm.
outcomes are far better than those patients who start dialysis being anemic. And so obviously being well controlled in the NDD space through Vafseo is really important. NDD's a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. It's got about the same number of patients as dialysis does, but the pricing is more traditional. It's Medicare Part B, it's Medicaid, it's commercial insurance. And
Hmm.
so we expect pricing instead of the $2,500 per year that we see in dialysis will be 4 to 5 times greater than that. Therefore, if dialysis is $1 billion opportunity, non-dialysis is 4 to 5 times that. And we as a company working super hard there. We've received feedback from the FDA on a protocol. We're engaged with them around that protocol and NDD, and we're planning for a Type C meeting with the plan to initiate a phase 3 study in the second half of the year.
Excellent. That's very exciting. Do you feel that, you mentioned the, exploration of decreasing hospitalization and mortality. Do you feel those are the biggest levers to pull in terms of differentiating Vafseo, in terms of your mention of wanting to become standard of care? Are those sort of the greatest components to focus on, or are there other aspects that could help, push Vafseo into the forefront?
Yeah, certainly in dialysis, obviously hospital mortality are the holy grails. If you can
Yeah.
hit those, that's great. In NDD, it's really interesting is every time I'm out with a physician, it's got a large unmet medical need. Only
Mm,
about 30% of patients actually receive treatment for their anemia in pre-dialysis. Right now, if you look at ESAs in that space, they're really used as rescue therapy.
mm,
So a patient's hemoglobin drops. In some cases, they wait to a hemoglobin of 9 or below to treat. And then they'll get them in the range. They'll wait till it comes back down to 9. They'll treat again. And it creates what they call hemoglobin cycling, right?
hmm.
And hemoglobin cycling has demonstrated that it actually increases safety issues associated with anemia management. And so a lot of times physicians would rather not treat in that
Mm,
space.
hmm.
Every physician we've talked to has said that an oral therapy to help treat anemia in non-dialysis would be super, super important for patients.
And very differentiated, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's great. Um, Kind of one nuanced question. So for Vafseo, there's the distinction around dose titration once patients are on therapy. Maybe you could just briefly talk about how dose titration for optimum benefit could play into prescriptions, potentially refills at higher doses, or is that something that's kind of on the radar commercially?
Yeah, no, it's a super, super important question. If you remember, the
Okay.
starting dose of Vafseo is 300 milligrams in dialysis.
Hmm.
And then dose based on a patient's hemoglobin, they would titrate up or down from there.
Hmm.
What we've seen in the first quarter of launch is about a third of our prescriptions were refills. And what we saw in those refills is doctors titrating up. They were
Mm,
titrating up to a level that was about very, very similar to what we saw in our Innovate pivotal studies, which is
hmm.
about a 40% increase in dose. And so when we talk about an average price of 15,500 per year, that was at the starting dose. Imagine a dose where a patient is well controlled being about 40% higher than that.
Excellent. That's very helpful. As we get closer to the end here, I wanted to make sure I asked you, what do you think are the most important near-term catalysts? I know you mentioned the LDO progress. What should be on investors' radars as we look to the next coming quarters?
Yeah, it's really Vafseo, Vafseo, Vafseo. So first,
Mm-hmm.
unlocking that additional DO, I think getting that pilot started successfully in the third quarter is critically important. And then
Mm-hmm.
also coming out of that pilot and making it broadly available, really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The second thing is voice enrollment. That study at the end of Q1 was about 75% enrolled, and we've seen very strong enrollment since. And so getting voice fully enrolled is important because the quicker you get enrolled, the quicker you get an answer. And then that hospitalization and mortality is important. The
Mm-hmm.
lastly is progress on NDD, making
Mm-hmm.
sure that we've got a path forward with the FDA and can start the study as expeditiously as possible.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. And maybe just to wrap things up, do you feel there are certain aspects of the Akebia platform or story that are currently underappreciated by investors or the market? Like any specific points that you'd like to help, drill home for folks?
Yeah, it's interesting because, investors are really focused on Vafseo, and that's probably where they should be.
Mm-hmm.
But we've actually got a pipeline of HIF assets out there. The first AKB 9090, that should be in the clinic this year, where we're studying acute kidney injury. Significant unmet need there. Quickly following on that, we have AKB 10108. That's HIF technology that we're studying for the prevention of ROP, or retinopathy of prematurity.
Mm-hmm.
That's an orphan disease where we may actually be able to impact blindness in premature babies. And so really interesting early stage assets in our HIT platforms that we'd love to talk about
Mm-hmm.
more. But frankly, until we demonstrate continued success with Vafseo, it's hard to get folks to focus on any of those cool things going on in our pipeline.
Sure. No, that's very helpful and very exciting. I mean, it's going to be great to see the progress with Vafseo and the evolution of the platform in the near term here. So with that, I'd like to thank Nick and Akebia Therapeutics for a great discussion on their platform. This is really helpful. And thank you again, everyone, for joining
Thanks, Matt.
us.
Appreciate it.